Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Max Osborn. I'm a PhD candidate at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I will be presenting some preliminary findings on trans and non-binary care and support during the COVID-19 pandemic. I first want to apologize that I can't be there with you live. I actually had top surgery last week and then experienced some unexpected complications, and the rescheduled follow-up visit ended up conflicting with my scheduled presentation time. So I do apologize for that, but I do hope to be around for the rest of the weekend, and I will be checking the platform, so please do leave questions if you have them, and I will try to get back to you. And I do want to thank the conference organizers again for being so flexible and letting me put this video together, and being so accommodating of my own trans health needs at this trans health conference. So to begin, as most of us are well aware, trans and non-binary people experience numerous obstacles accessing formal support services, including provider gatekeeping, discrimination and lack of cultural competence, internalized stigma, and lack of availability and affordability. Many of the presentations we'll see this weekend, I would imagine, deal with exactly these obstacles. As a result, informal networks of care have emerged within trans communities, with many preferring to rely on trusted peers or community members rather than service providers or institutions. In the excellent book titled Trans Care, Hill Malatino states that, quote, "Some of what binds us to one another is directly tied to the affective and practical disinvestment of the people and institutions we've needed or been forced to rely upon for survival. We have learned to care for one another in the aftermath of these refusals," end quote. The history of this communal care includes direct one-to-one peer interactions and friend groups, but also support groups, activism and organizing, zines and newsletters to share resources, and crowdfunding for medical expenses, among other things. Over the past year and a half, the COVID-19 pandemic has intensified existing inequities and access barriers, as well as prompting the expansion of informal forms of support. And it's that latter topic that I'd like to talk a little bit more about today. So I focus here on two research questions. One, what strategies do trans and non-binary people use to give and receive emotional and material support outside of formal or institutional contexts? And two, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted trans and non-binary support networks? So this data was taken from my dissertation, which is a broader project on institutional contact and help seeking among LGBTQIA+ people. So for this analysis, I only included data from the 31 participants who identified as transgender and or non-binary. I conducted semi-structured interviews over Zoom in the fall of 2020, covering topics such as identity and presentation, risk and safety across contexts, police encounters, formal and informal help seeking and support services, and the pandemic. To give a brief overview of the sample, participants' ages range from 21 to 56 years old with a mean of 31 years. And I am showing overviews of race, gender, and sexual orientation here, but I want to note that I ask people to self-identify with whatever words felt applicable to them, rather than giving a closed-ended list of options. So I think that's always preferable, but it also does make it harder to summarize and present. So just in terms of the gender breakdown, I want to first state that roughly 2/3 of participants self-identified as non-binary. So that's one way of looking at things. And also as an alternative, I am noting like which percentage of people identified themselves as transmasculine, either binary or non-binary, transfeminine, non-binary without referencing either masculinity or femininity or something else entirely. And again, it gets complicated because people used multiple identity terms to describe themselves, or used unique terms that weren't shared by other people. So obviously neither of these presentations is going to fully capture the complexity of the sample, but I am still navigating how to summarize the information usefully without reducing people to categories that flatten their identities. And a final note, whenever I refer to a specific participant using identity terms for race, gender, or sexual orientation, I'm using the language that they chose for themselves. So for the rest of this presentation, I would like to discuss some of the advantages and challenges that trans and non-binary people encountered when engaging with informal support networks during the pandemic, and also to spotlight some of the participants' perspectives. In terms of people's experiences during the pandemic, findings were fairly consistent with existing literature showing that the pandemic exacerbated existing barriers to accessing formal support. So people had new or increased medical, mental health, and financial needs, and encountered provider overload and burnout. Unsurprisingly, during the pandemic, as in general, trans and non-binary people frequently turned to informal sources of support such as friends, family, partners, and each other. Notably, most of the people I talked to discussed not only receiving support, but also ways they were engaged in giving support to other people in their communities, either as part of an organized effort or on a one-to-one basis. So very few people describe themselves as only giving or only receiving. And this is just some of the types of informal support that people gave and received, which included distributing food and supplies, donating to bail funds for people who've been arrested, exchanging information or skills such as teaching or translating, and fundraising for housing and medical costs. So to kind of summarize this impetus behind this support, here's a quote by one of the participants, who was a Vietnamese non-binary person who's 26 years old, explaining why they chose primarily to rely on informal sources of support during the pandemic. Institutions are already doing a roundabout way of trying to take care of you, or the systems are being compromised like they are right now. Why would I trust in somebody that hasn't been able to help me? Why wouldn't I lean on the people that are in the same here and now as I am, like my neighbors, my friends, lovers, whoever? So this person viewed commonality of experience and identity as really important in determining who they felt comfortable relying on. They wanted to receive care from people who had been in similar situations to their own and whom they felt that they could relate to. And this was a sentiment that was shared by a number of participants. Next, I want to briefly discuss some strengths and advantages to relying on informal support and community care networks during the pandemic, and specifically how trans people's socializing and communication changed. So participants described their social circles becoming smaller and more close-knit, their communication and boundary setting skills developing, and mutual aid and organized support efforts growing and expanding. So first, people stated that their social circles contracted in terms of size, but became much closer. So peripheral acquaintances and friends kind of fell away, leaving behind groups of friends and family that were smaller, but that people perceived as much more reliable and more able to give support. So this is a quote from a white Jewish and Latino woman describing her experience receiving support during the pandemic. There has been a winnowing of everyone's relationships. I think the question of who is a friend and who is an acquaintance since this whole situation started has become a lot less ambiguous. I know who my friends are, and I know who my colleagues are, and I know who my acquaintances are. That is a lot more black and white now. It has been very isolating for me, and I feel like there are far fewer people I can call on for support. But the people I can call on for support, I know I can count on them. And similarly, another quote, this one is from a 56-year-old Black and Hispanic woman describing her approach to helping other people in her circles. Because of the pandemic, I check in with people regularly. Because the thing is, you never know. You have to check on people because people are important to me. People are important, especially my close circles. And so I try to stay in contact with them to make sure they're all right. I mean, I try to do something every day. So essentially, participants were reporting more frequent, closer, and more intense contact with fewer people, especially in terms of giving and receiving care. And sometimes this involves sharing material resources, but it appeared equally important to maintain frequent communication with other people and offer emotional support if needed. And next, participants talked about how their communication skills developed during this period of crisis. So one of the same participants I quoted before also stated, during the pandemic right now, you're just being tested on the different ways you need to adapt to communicate with whoever it is that you want to be close with. And this person went on to talk more about how they had learned to better articulate and communicate their emotional needs to other people, including setting boundaries about the type of social interactions that they had the energy for, what they wanted or didn't want from interactions. And they mentioned that this seemed to come about directly as a result of the pandemic. So essentially the upheaval of normal social patterns of interaction allowed for a renegotiation of norms and boundaries, and presented an opportunity for people to more clearly set the terms for the types of interactions they needed and desired. Not only that, but the mutual understanding that everyone was under an intense amount of stress created opportunities for extending empathy to others and also prompted a tendency to be more accommodating to others people's needs. And not only that, but also to be more proactive about asking explicitly about those needs. So this represented not just a shift in the type of care being practiced, but in the way that care processes and social interactions were being navigated. And lastly, many participants mentioned becoming involved with mutual aid groups or community care efforts that either had not existed prior to the pandemic or that they had not previously been involved with. Again, this seems like kind of an obvious response to the increased need for services and care among trans communities and the continued difficulties with formal service access. But participants also mentioned that they felt really motivated to help others and that they felt especially compelled to do so because it was a crisis. So the pandemic kind of became a catalyst for people who had not previously been involved in group care work to now finally take that step. Next, I want to talk about some of the major obstacles to trans people giving and receiving care during the pandemic, the first being social isolation and the second being increased strain on existing networks. Although, as I mentioned, many people felt newly motivated to get involved in community care efforts or to check up on their loved ones, the lack of normal social interaction was unsurprisingly really hard on people's mental health and impeded these care processes for a lot of people. While the understanding that everyone was under a lot of stress created a sense of solidarity and empathy, it also created an impression among some participants that because everyone was struggling, it was harder to feel that other people were available to be called on, and also sometimes harder to kind of muster up the energy to offer support to other people. So this is a quote from one of the participants, a 28-year-old white and Jewish non-binary person. We're all dealing with so much stress and life stuff separately that there's sometimes less day-to-day support or kind of like preventative support available, where it's like, oh, I'm just not getting these regular interactions that are nourishing. Participants also described how the pandemic placed even more of a burden on the people who are already dealing with the most intense inequities or who would experience the most trauma in the first place. So this is kind of a longer quote, but I think it's an important one. This is from a 21-year-old Indian American non-binary genderqueer person. We already know institutions have been harming us and have failed us. I'm tasked now with understanding why we are also doing that. We're unable to support each other and why we're continuing to fail us and not support us. You have to be constantly communicating your boundaries and needs and all this stuff, which is also something that's more accessible to privileged queer people than it is for other people, right? To even process your emotions in a certain way and identify your triggers. When you're still trying to meet your basic needs also, it's not something that you can prioritize. So I want to bring this up, especially because it's been demonstrated that informal community care networks can often inadvertently replicate existing power hierarchies and inequalities. So I'm thinking like specifically of Chris Barcelos' work on crowdfunding for trans medical care and how it often turns out that relatively more privileged people, such as white transmasculine people, end up being most successful at gaining an audience or raising money. And in this example, this participant expressed that the people in their community who were already under the most stress and who often had the least access to formal supports like mental health care and other resources for handling those stresses were now in the midst of this crisis being called upon to kind of expertly navigate their own traumas in a way that was like healthy, productive, avoiding harm to others, and that was a kind of an extraordinary burden to place on people. And a burden that has only intensified as energy and resources became spread thin during the pandemic. So to recap, while the pandemic prompted a lot of non-binary and trans people to strengthen their core social networks, reassess their communication styles and boundaries, and become more involved in community care efforts, it also placed an increased burden on the people who are already struggling the most and threatened to reproduce existing inequities in access to care and resources. Therefore, I would suggest that it's important to both seize these new opportunities to adjust communication styles and the organization of care networks and potentially improve them, but also that it's crucial during these adjustments to center members of trans communities who are being the most impacted by the pandemic and who had the greatest obstacles to accessing care beforehand. And in general, to constantly examine who is being left out of care networks, how are resources being allocated, and who is taking on the most responsibility in caring for others. And I want to close out on a bit of a hopeful note with another participant's words, which are the inspiration for the title of this presentation. So this is a quote from a 30-year-old white person who self-identified as a gender variant dyke. I think it continues to kind of be our legacy. There's something about queer people and community, the way we make space with each other, that fosters itself outside an institution. And I find that fascinating. Like we can even have all the queer theory studies programs and all the grad schools, and even still the way we gather will be different. You know, I don't think that's something that will go away soon. I think that's one of the beautiful parts about it. Sorry, not to disparage the research that we're all here this weekend to present and discuss, but obviously academia is very much an institution, just as medical providers, the legal system, and social services are institutions. And I want to point to the importance of recognizing how and why that process of making space outside of institutions occurs organically, and the difficulty of summing up the nuances of these care networks and practices, especially in a 15-minute presentation of qualitative data. But I'm always available to talk more often, either about these findings or these topics more generally, and would definitely welcome any questions or comments on this work that is very much still in development. So thank you so much.